The start of NFL free agency is almost here, and there are rumors all over the place about the Jets. Who could be leaving? Who could be staying? Who could be coming? Let's break down the latest Jets rumors today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, March 7th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, it's tough to believe, but the start of free agency is almost here. In fact, it begins next week. And there are all sorts of rumors from people in the know about what the New York Jets may do in free agency, players they may add, players they may lose. Let's break down the latest Jets rumors on today's episode. Now, the first player I want to talk about is the guy who was the team MVP last year, Jamien Sherwood. And Zach Rosenblatt of The Athletic has reported that the Jets do have some interest in bringing Sherwood back, but the market for Sherwood seems to be pretty robust, so it's not clear the Jets are going to be able to bring him back. The top linebacker who was set to hit free agency, Zach Baun of the Eagles, re-signed with the Super Bowl champions on a 3-year deal. So that sets the market to a degree. Baun's contract, again, was a 3-year deal worth $51 million. So if you're looking for what the top of the market gets, that's about where you'll go this offseason. Sherwood's not on Baun's level at this point, but a very solid player. And I think that it's tough that the Jets are in this spot because, look, I've been a longtime Jets fan, and I just have these horrible memories of the Jets letting quality linebackers go who go on to have success with other teams. I mean, you can go back to the Jets drafting James Farrior in 1997. He was actually Bill Parcells' first draft pick. Parcells actually made a mistake. He traded down a couple of times and passed on a couple of tackles who went to the Hall of Fame. That's a story for another day. He ended up drafting Farrior in the top 10. Jets started with the number 1 overall pick, a couple trade downs. They select Farrior. And Farrior had a very uneven start to his career. Then his final Jets season in 2001, he played outstanding football, ended up earning a deal from the Pittsburgh Steelers, and went on to have a very long and very productive career in Pittsburgh. It was almost like the Jets trained him to have success elsewhere. A couple of years later, the Jets drafted Jonathan Vilma in the 2004 NFL draft in the first round. And his career got off to a really good start. Then Eric Mangini came in as the head coach. Mangini installed a 3-4 defense, which did not fit Vilma. And it's not just that it didn't fit Vilma, it didn't really fit anybody on the roster. Vilma ended up being traded after 2 seasons in Mangini's scheme, went to the Saints, and within a couple seasons, he helped them win a Super Bowl. In fact, was one of the unsung heroes of that Super Bowl because in that Super Bowl against the Indianapolis Colts, Vilma went head-to-head with Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning was changing plays at the line nonstop, and that's what Peyton Manning always did. Vilma was changing the back to counter Manning in real time, and the Saints won the Super Bowl. So I have a long and tortured history of watching the Jets give up good linebackers and watching them go elsewhere and have great success. And one of the things that's frustrating for me is, if you've seen Jamien Sherwood's career, the Jets drafted him as a day 3 pick out of Auburn. He was a converted safety prospect. They moved him from safety to linebacker. Some uneven start to his career, as you'd expect a late round pick who's changing positions. But year 3, he developed into a quality part-time player. Year 4, because of C.J. Mosley's injuries, Sherwood stepped into a full-time role and ended up being named team MVP, which, on this year's Jets may not be the greatest accomplishment in the world, but it shows that he is now an effective starting linebacker. And I really hate situations like this where you spend years developing a guy and then that guy goes somewhere else. And look, it's not this regime's fault. I mean, it's the last regime's fault. The last regime gets credit for finding him and developing him. But I also think that the last regime, Joe Douglas, Robert Saleh, Jeff Ulbrich, maybe did not appreciate what they had on their hands with Sherwood because Sherwood was supposed to enter last season as a backup linebacker. And, he was supposed to back up C.J. Mosley and Quincy Williams. And look, everybody thinks C.J. Mosley is a really professional guy, a good locker room guy. But he's getting on there in years. And maybe the Jets should have looked to move on. Maybe the Jets were a little, and this is something you could say across the board. And, to an extent, it's a second guess. It's not like I was saying any of this at the time. But I'm also not watching these guys on a day-to-day basis on the practice field. Maybe the Jets should have been preparing Sherwood to start. maybe the Jets should have been a little bit more proactive in trying to get him back into the fold, because by this point, there's no real incentive for Sherwood to work out a deal with the Jets that's favorable to New York. And the only reason it would make sense for Sherwood to take a deal at this point with free agency a couple days away is if the Jets just blow him away with an offer, because otherwise you go see what's out there, you see how many bidders are out there. And by the way, two of your former defensive coaches, Ulbrich and Saleh, are now defensive coordinators in this league, and their teams could be looking for linebackers. This is a tough spot for the Jets. Now, the one question I had was whether Aaron Glenn would want to keep Sherwood, because Glenn's instituting a new system. Glenn kind of likes his linebackers to do it all. Sherwood's a good player. He was good against the run. He was kind of good at reading blocks this year. He's not great at shedding blocks. And when the Jets had issues in the run game this year, I blame the defensive line more than anything. When the defensive line's not playing well, it means linebackers have to shed blocks. You would not expect a converted safety who's on the smaller side to be effective at doing that. Sherwood, he's not a great guy in coverage, but I think he's serviceable in coverage. In today's NFL, you ideally like your linebackers to be able to cover, but I don't think you can complain about the results of Sherwood this past season. He's a guy I've been hoping the Jets would be able to figure out a way to keep, because I really do believe that in the NFL, the best way to build a team is to keep your own guys, because they're established within your locker room. Now you have the dynamic of a new system. Normally, I'd say you have a guy who's familiar with the system. Jets obviously aren't familiar with the system. The current Jets aren't that familiar with the system. But looking at this offseason, the other option the Jets would have would be to maybe bring back C.J. Mosley for another year. But I would question that from the standpoint that it just feels to me like Mosley has reached a point where maybe his body is starting to break down. I mean, he did not hold up last year. And, if we're going to be honest, and I don't want to be dismissive of CJ Mosley, because he's a very good player in this league. And again, he's a good leader in the locker room. And I think that there's an argument to be made when when you have a new coach instilling a new culture. Maybe you want a guy like CJ Mosley around to kind of help with that process, because he's a veteran guy, especially as your team gets younger. You need some veteran guys to show younger guys the ropes, show younger guys how to prepare themselves. But Mosley, the Jets gave him a huge contract in 2019. Jets made him one of the top 5 defensive players in the league in 2019, and they've gotten one Pro Bowl out of it. I don't think this is what the Jets thought they were signing up for. And, I don't think that Mosley should be the guy that prevents you from keeping Sherwood. I mean, that's what I would say. Again, Jets are in a tough spot right now, because we know their cap woes. We know that, look, the Jets, when I say the Jets have cap woes, that doesn't mean that, they're going to be incapable of signing anybody. But it does mean they're going to have to prioritize this offseason. It does mean that there are probably some holes that they won't be able to fill. They probably won't be able to do this all in one offseason. That's not an excuse for ineffective signings. The Jets should be able to fill some of their holes, certainly. But to me, Sherwood would be a guy I'd really like to see them prioritize. The problem, though, is the price. We've gotten to a point where he's everything like I want in a free agent. He's a young guy on his second contract, entering his prime. He's an ascending player, but the price is not going to be exorbitant, because last year was his first year as a starter, but his last year's first year as a starter is an indication that he's an ascending player. So I would like to see the Jets figure out a way to make this happen, but it sounds like pessimism is growing. Hopefully something changes in the next couple of days and the Jets are able to lock up Sherwood. But look, you never know this. I mean, a year ago I was saying a lot of the stuff about Bryce Huff, and Huff ended up signing with Philadelphia, and even though the Eagles won the Super Bowl, Huff did nothing to contribute. So maybe sometimes a guy who appears to be ascending really isn't. But I'm really hoping that the trajectory of this changes in the next 48 to 72 hours, because I would really be disappointed to see the Jets lose Jamien Sherwood, and it sounds like there's at least some degree of risk for that right now. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will turn our attention to a position that may not be viewed as a premium position for the Jets, but it's a position where they might target, at least according to one report. We'll break down who they might be going after as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. You will love using FanDuel's live betting feature, because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, you'll never feel like you missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Free agency begins next week. Let the craziness begin. The Jets, may not have the most cap space in the league, at least relative to their needs, but they will be able to make some moves. And ESPN this week kind of ran a free agency projection. They essentially put team beat writers in charge of what their teams will do, and they allowed beat writers to bid on free agents. Rich Cimini placed was able to land a Dolphin safety Jevon Holland on a 4-year, $80 million contract. So essentially, this was kind of like a mock free agency. Cimini, who's the ESPN beat writer, had the Jets get the Holland, who's a safety. Now, there's a caveat here. I would assume that Cimini is kind of guessing what he thinks the Jets will do here. I was a bit surprised that safety would be the spot where the Jets would look to spend big. And I'm not sure that necessarily would be the right move. So this is not, the one caveat, this is not insider information, but it is, somebody with insider information kind of guessing what direction the Jets would go in. Look, it's clear that the Jets need help at the safety position. I mean, I think the Jets actually only have one safety under contract at the moment. Now, they want to bring back Tony Adams. That could be pretty easy, but the other safety spots unclear. Chuck Clark's a free agent, not expected back. Did not justify in any way a return. Ashton Davis is set to be a free agent. I mean, I think we've seen at best Ashton Davis is a role player. He's like a dime safety. Maybe he can play a little like linebacker in small personnel packages. He can help on special teams, but he's not a guy you'd want to depend on any expanded role. Holland is a very good player for Miami. I mean, he kind of does. He does a little bit of everything. He's decent. He can play the deep middle. He can play the run, and he was actually part of a rather infamous play in Jets history. You may remember, of course, if you're a Jets fan, you remember the Black Friday game in 2023 when Tim Boyle threw an interception on a Hail Mary that was returned 100 yards or over 100 yards for a touchdown. And Jevon Holland was the guy who picked that pass off. I feel like we talk about the safety position a lot with the Jets, and a lot of it probably goes back to the 2017 draft when the Jets drafted Jamal Adams 6th overall and then doubled down by drafting Marcus May in the second round. And that was very controversial for many reasons, the first of which was the Jets drafted Jamal Adams over Patrick Mahomes. And there's all sorts of discussions that have been happening since the Jets made that fateful decision. Beyond that, it was very unconventional for the Jets to draft a pair of safeties back-to-back because safety is generally viewed as a fairly low-impact position. There are great safeties in the league, and great safety can change the game. If you go back to Earl Thomas, you go back to Eric Berry, although Berry's prime was kind of cut short because of health issues that he had, or if you want to go back another generation, Ed Reed and Troy Polamalu. But there just aren't a lot of safeties who changed the game. There are definitely guys who have different, and there are different types of safeties who do that. Guys like Reed and Thomas were great single high safeties. They were guys who had a lot of range. You put them in the middle of the field, they could cover most of the field deep. They pretty much took away the seam routes and they took away the posts. The deep middle was off the table when you had one of those guys. They have your guys like Polamalu, who was more of somebody who just flew all over the field. He was kind of an eraser. If somebody made a mistake, Polamalu would get there and make the tackle. Then you have your guys like Cam Chancellor, who essentially were, for all intents and purposes, linebackers. Chancellor was Thomas's partner with the Legion of Boom. Holland is a guy who, he's more of a do-it-all kind of guy. The thing is, and I do like the idea. He's 25 years old. This would be his second contract. So I'm a big fan of the idea of getting guys on second contracts, not third contracts, not fourth contracts, but second contracts, because the second contract is usually after you're 4 years into the league. And when you're entering year 5, that's around the prime of most players' careers. So you're paying for them for their best years. Where if you got a guy on his third contract, you're typically paying him for past production, but the future is not going to be as good. So I like the idea of spending on a guy who's 25, who's going to be getting his second contract. What I don't love is the idea that it's at the safety position, because Holland is good. He's very good, but you can get decent safety play without needing to break the bank. And while Holland is good, I mean, I don't know that he's on the level of the guys I mentioned. We talk about positional value in the NFL, and people misunderstand what positional value means. We talk about it in the first round. Should you draft a player at this position or that position? And the response people always have is, well, if he's a great player, he's a great player. Who cares? And that's true. Somebody can be a great player at any position. I mean, we can rule out fullback, or we can rule out kicker, or punter, or long snapper. But a guy who's a great player at pretty much any normal position moves the needle for your team. What makes a position a premium position is that there are more players who do it. That's one of the key components of positional value, is that the wide receiver position, there might be like 20, 25 players who really move the needle. At the quarterback position, the guys who are there. At the edge rusher spot, lots of guys can generate sacks. Then there are the positions where you don't really have a lot of guys who make a big difference, but there are lots of guys who make very little money, who are credible players, who prevent those positions from being a black hole. Running back's one of them. How many running backs really change the game? Maybe we've underestimated running back a little bit if you look at the impact Saquon Barkley had with the Eagles, because looking back, the Eagles signing Barkley a year ago will go down as one of the great free agent signings in the history of the league. I mean, that was the type of thing that transformed that team. But there aren't a lot of Saquon Barkleys in the league. At the tight end position, there are not a lot of great tight ends. I think linebacker is another spot where, if you have a great linebacker, if you have somebody who's off the charts good, he'll change your defense. But safety is another spot. The difference between a good safety and an average safety, I don't know that it really changes a whole lot about your trajectory as a defense or your trajectory as a team. And there are some positions, and safety is one of them. I say this every year around this time. You don't need to be the team that sets the market at the safety position, because it always feels like we get to May or June, and there's some quality safety who hasn't been signed yet for whatever reason. Maybe he's coming off an injury. Maybe he's overestimated the market for his services. And, essentially every team signed a player at his position. Every team signed a safety, and now he doesn't have a home. So he has to settle for a cheap 1-year deal. Look, the Jets did not do a great job with the safety position last year. And look, I'll be honest with you, I thought Chuck Clark was going to be better. Jets traded for Chuck Clark from Baltimore 2 years ago. I thought it was a really savvy move. And he got injured that first year, so I don't know how much the injury impacted it. But Clark did not really pan out the way the Jets were hoping. But that doesn't mean that you're incapable of finding a quality safety for a cheap price. Look, maybe Aaron Glenn thinks that his defense needs a great safety to function. I would question that. And look, I'm not against the idea of the Jets signing Jevon Holland, but I don't think that he should be the top priority. I think there are other spots, namely playmaker, where the Jets should really keep a focus. Now, you're on the Locked On Jets podcast. There's one more rumor out there. It's not a surprising rumor. New coaches want familiar faces. And at least according to one reporter, it sounds like Aaron Glenn might be interested in bringing some familiar faces to New York. There's a logic to it. I'll explain that logic as we continue here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Friday, getting ready for the start of free agency next week. All kinds of rumors going around the New York Jets right now. Back to Zach Rosenblatt of The Athletic, who really seems keyed into the organization. He has a report out that it's not a surprise, but the Jets may target some depth players from the Detroit Lions in free agencies. This includes Tim Patrick, a wide receiver, Derek Barnes, a linebacker, Melon Fonlu, a safety, Marcus Davenport, a defensive end, guys from both sides of the ball. And there's a logic to this, and it's not unusual with new regimes. They like to bring in guys from their previous stop, and it's not really about favoritism. I think that there's maybe a perception that there's nepotism, though they know this guy, they want to bring him in. There's actually a logic behind bringing in players from your former stop. And that's they have a very intricate knowledge of your system. They understand how your system runs, and they can kind of help you. And you usually see this as backup. You usually see backup depth type players get signed for these roles, and they essentially become an extension of the coaching staff for that first training camp. Because once you get 2-3 years in, players start to understand the nuances of the system. The NFL playbooks these days are very detailed. There's lots of depth built into, even within plays, there can be lots of different concepts that are built in depending to counter what the offense does. It requires you to understand how to read certain things. Sometimes it's the player's positioning, sometimes it's the player's technique, sometimes it's a route combination that dictates the way your unit adjusts. And these guys can kind of like help the coaching staff talk through difficult concepts to teammates. They can kind of be a resource because they understand it. They've functioned in these environments before. So I think that there's a real logic behind this. Robert Saleh actually admitted that Jets did not do that his first year. His second year, they ended up bringing a lot of former 49ers in on the defensive side of the ball. And he admitted that, you know what, we probably should have had some guys who had a deeper understanding of the system, because that first year, the Jets defense was really bad. And the real issue was there was a lack of talent on the unit. I mean, make no mistake about it. 2021 Jets did not have enough talent, and that was the biggest reason their defense was bad. But there was a real lack of understanding of basic concepts, and part of it was youth. But part of it, I think, was that the Jets did not bring in guys who understood Saleh's system. And these guys don't need to be superstars. Sometimes they're just backups. First of all, it means you have a depth guy in a situational role who can step on the field and know what he's doing, which is nice to have. Second is they can point stuff out on the field. Before plays, they can kind of make checks to make sure everything's functioning as it should be. But even on the practice field, they can like kind of help their teammates understand. It's another resource that the teammates can go to. And for the Jets, it makes sense to bring in guys from the Lions on both sides of the ball, because the Jets are installing Aaron Glenn's defense, which was, he was the defensive coordinator, but they're also installing an offense with the coordinator Tanner Engstrand, who was Detroit's passing game coordinator. So we can presume that on both sides of the ball, the Jets are going to be focused on Detroit style systems, installing them. So I think that there's a real logic behind this. These will not be very exciting signings. These are not going to be signings I'm going to say are great signings, but that's the logic behind them. And I think that that's very likely. Rosenblatt also indicated Joshua Palmer is a player who could interest the Jets. And he's a wide receiver. And we know the Jets wide receiver room right now is, let's say, in a state of flux, because without Devontae Adams there's not really a lot behind Garrett Wilson, and Allen Lazard's probably on his way out. But even if they bring back Allen Lazard, are you going to feel good with Allen Lazard on this team next year? Are you going to say this receiving room looks fine now with Allen Lazard? Of course not. So Joshua Palmer could be a target, and I'm not surprised by this. In some ways, Palmer kind of fits the mold of what I'm looking for, because again, he's a guy 25 years old on his second contract, and he's a deep threat. I cannot say I'd be terribly excited with him though, because his production hasn't been that great. And there are certain things I look for in a free agent. One is youth. Yeah, but another thing I look for is a sign that the player is ascending. And there really hasn't been an upward trajectory with Palmer. I mean, 2 years ago, he was over 700 yards. A year where since then he's had a year where he's banged up. But, a guy who at this point is kind of a deep ball specialist. And I feel like speed is important. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you speed is not important with an offense. Look, I've been very vocal. I think the Jets should try and add more home run threats. But at the receiver position, you're very limited if all you can do is be a deep threat. And, I'm not sure Palmer has really developed as a route runner in other areas. And I do think that sometimes teams get a little overconfident in their ability to coach guys up. They'll see a guy has speed and say, well, you can't teach speed. And I guess that's true, but it's a lot tougher to teach the other stuff than you think. Now, the counter to this is, quite frankly, it's just not a great year to want a receiver in free agency. And look, if you're asking me would I rather have Palmer or would I rather have Xavier Gipson, Malachi Corley starting, I'd probably go with Palmer, because he's at least got a guy with some experience in the league, a guy with at least some degree of a track record, even if it's not that great. And, maybe you roll the dice on him. I can't imagine he's going to cost much. And look, I don't think that the boom scenario is as likely as a lot of people will make it out to be if the Jets sign him, but it does exist. He could conceivably end up being a decent value signing if his play improves, if he is able to develop some other aspects of his game. But this alone is not going to fix the Jets wide receiver position. He's a guy who at a certain price is probably worth a roll of the dice, probably worth a lottery ticket, but probably not a guy who really moves the needle. That said, I mean, it's not going to be easy to find the guys who move the needle. The Jets, the teams that have good wide receivers tend to keep them. And the Jets are an exception. Jets are letting Devontae Adams go because Devontae Adams didn't really make sense for the team. So Jets found themselves in a tough spot at wide receiver. It's worth keeping an eye on. One of the guys I mentioned from Detroit, Tim Patrick, he's more of a bigger type possession receiver. I don't think either of these guys really help. I think I'd feel comfortable with either of these guys as the number 2 receiver. But if they're depth pieces, both of them have their logic. Patrick for maybe his knowledge of Tanner Engstrand's system, and Palmer for maybe speed. Perhaps there's something to develop there. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening to let you know if you miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.